Hi, everyone. I'm Doug Campbell, philosophy professor at Alma College and host of the Ancient Philosophy podcast. Today's episode is on Ecclesiastes, which is an important book in the Hebrew Bible. Before we talk about the content of this text and who wrote it, it's important to say something about the wisdom literature genre in which this text participates. So this book is an instance of wisdom literature, which is to say that it's a set of observations about the world and where humans fit into that picture. Wisdom, in the case of this text, is gained from experience, as we'll talk about when we're exploring the content of the text. And specifically, this book appears in the third part of the Hebrew Bible, in the portion of the Tanakh that we call the Ketuvim, which means writings. And so it appears alongside other such texts in the Hebrew Bible, such as Esther. The title of the text is Greek. So our English word Ecclesiastes, right? That's related to other words like ecclesiastical and so on, and it's coming from the Greek. And so it's actually the title of this text, Ecclesiastes, is actually a transliteration of the Greek word Ecclesiastes, which means one of the assembly or a member of the assembly. That is picking up on the core meaning of the word in Hebrew. The Hebrew title of this book is Qoheleth, which is the name also given to the author. The Hebrew word Qoheleth is coming from a word that means assembly. But whereas the Greek word Ecclesiastes, which is the translation of Qoheleth, whereas the Greek word Ecclesiastes has this obvious or uncontroversial meaning to Greek scholars as one of the assembly, it's actually not obvious what Qoheleth means beyond its etymological connection to assembly. It's some kind of participle, meaning that it's an adjective or a noun that's being formed from a verb. And the verb in this case meaning something like assembling or putting together. And we'll talk about that as we go into what the person's name Qoheleth means. But before we get into what exactly the word Qoheleth might mean, it's important to say this is actually given to us as the author's name. So the very first line of Ecclesiastes is the words of Qoheleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Those are the very first words. But we shouldn't think that Qoheleth is a person's birth name. In fact, it is a pen name. And then there's a theory that it's supposed to be the pen name of King Solomon. We'll talk about that idea in a second. But before we get there, now let's talk about this word Qoheleth. It claims to be someone's name, but it's in fact more like someone's pen name or pseudonym. And it could mean, for example, one who assembles people, one who assembles opinions, one who assembles views on a subject and then decides which view is the right one. It is grammatically a feminine word. That doesn't have to mean that the person to whom it applies is feminine, but that is the way that it's historically been taken. And then the idea is that, well, if you think that this is King Solomon, you have to explain why it's feminine, this word. But like some of the theories that are punching around is that like it's feminine because it applies to someone who, even if they're a man, even if he's a man, still he's a feminine man. You know, it's quite difficult to understand specifically what the femininity of this word grammatically is supposed to get across. The majority opinion is that the word means one who has assembled people, such that they can be spoken to, such that they can be preached to, something like that. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean we're ruling out the idea that it's about assembling wisdom or assembling views or conflicting views, something like that. Now, as for who the author of this text really was, the classical rabbinic tradition thought that it was King Solomon. As I said, the first line of the text is the words of Koheleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem. That's Ecclesiastes 1:1. And that lends itself very naturally that the author is King Solomon, son of David. But we're also told at Ecclesiastes 1:12 that the author was once king of Jerusalem. It's written in the first person, but I'll read off this. So it's not like we're being told he was king of Jerusalem. The author is saying, and I'll read this now. This is from Ecclesiastes 1:12. I, Koheleth, was king in Jerusalem over Israel. So that's sometimes taken to be straightforward evidence that this author is King Solomon. And in 1 Kings chapter 3, for instance, we're told that Solomon was a wise person. He's portrayed that way in chapter 3 of 1 Kings. And so if Koheleth is supposed to be a sage, wise person, it fits that King Solomon was Koheleth because Solomon is portrayed as a wise person, right? In 1 Kings or 1 Kings. Ultimately, that's a deeply unlikely idea. The book was written most likely way, way, way too late for that possibility to be correct. The book, for instance, features Persian words such as pardes, which means a grove, pitgam, which means a sentence. So that grove is the use of the word for grove. That's Ecclesiastes 2:5, and the word for sentence is pitgam, which it appears at Ecclesiastes 8:11. If the book is featuring Persian words, as it is, that means it could not have been written before the post-exilic period in Jewish history, which means that the earliest the book could have been written was in the second half of the 6th century BC. So we're looking at the 500s BC, which means that it was written hundreds of years after King Solomon, even if indeed King Solomon ever lived, which is not obviously true. And there are other features pertinent to the literary style that gives us some way of dating the text to. The author's Hebrew, for example, has grammatical features that are very much quite late. The feminine singular demonstrative noun, for example, zo, and the negative particle ein being used with the infinitive. These are features of the grammatical features of Hebrew that are much later than would be true or would be the case if indeed Solomon wrote it. Still, however, the idea that it was Solomon is plain from the text. And so even though the author doesn't come out and say that he's Solomon and instead uses this pen name of the feminine participle of a verb that means something like assembling people, the intention was to make us think that the author was Solomon. But overall, the fact that we're going to date this book most likely between the 500s BC, that's the earliest would be in the 500s BC. That means we're ruling out Solomon's authorship, and also we're going to put the text. The latest it could be would be, let's say 200 BC. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, but it features among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means that which are a finding of important Jewish texts that date from no later than the 200 BC. So we can't, if we have instances of this that we could say, okay, well, it's not going to be any later than 200 BC, then we know it's written at some point between, let's say, the late 500s BC and 200 BC. The general theme of this book is the Knowledge we gain from wisdom, and wisdom in this in the case of this text is gained from experience. So experience gives us wisdom, and wisdom allows us to know things specifically about what's valuable and what isn't valuable, what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile. So the author is going to try to convince us or persuade us or transmit things he's learned from experience about what is valuable for a human being. And the topic or the topics that are covered by this text are things related to, say, for example, the cycles of the orders of nature, the amassing of wealth, the opposing forces that govern life, the presentation of friendship or companionship as an antidote to life's problems, the virtues and the difficulties of human authorities, the nature of folly, the joy of struggle, and the terrors of old age. The biggest idea is that everything we pursue is in vain or futile. Everything that we pursue is in vain or futile. That word in vain, it's a little misleading today because we don't have the same connotations with words like vanity and vain that English speakers used to. When people think about vanity today, they think of someone who is obsessed with the way they look or with appearances. But when I use the word vanity, and I'll try instead to just restrict myself to talking about futility. But when I use the word vanity, I mean something like you would gain nothing from it. It's not that you're not actually making any long-term progress when you're on something when you're doing it in vain. So futile tends to be a better word, the idea that something is useless. Specifically, the important point here is that due to some features of being a human and due to some features of what life on Earth is like, humans can't see a coherent pattern, a plan to their lives, a plan to nature. We don't have a sense of progress towards some kind of enduring or lasting goal. And even if there is such a pattern, humans can't really see such a pattern. This is very different from the certainty that's provided by the covenant tradition elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, the covenant being the pact or bargain that we make with God, or that the Jewish people made with God. So we see, for example, in Deuteronomy or most of Proverbs, that there is a huge amount of certainty provided by this covenant tradition. And that's very, very, very much not the case in Ecclesiastes. One source of certainty for us is death, that all humans, no matter what their background is, die. Death is a kind of equalizer or common denominator. Humans cannot rely on the possibility of surviving death because we can't be sure about it. And when we dive more deeply into the text momentarily, I'll read off a key passage about that. But what we're seeing is that this author did not believe in the afterlife. Part of that is that the author, he might have not believed, for all we know, he didn't believe that there was no afterlife, but he might have preferred to suspend judgment about it. But there are a lot of passages here that where the author seems very, very skeptical, leaning towards no, there is no afterlife. Part of the reason for that is, again, the reliance on experience as a source of wisdom. And then that wisdom, in turn, yields knowledge about what sorts of things we should value and pursue. To the extent that experience is the key, right? Life experience, we're obviously not going to make judgments about what the afterlife is like because such a thing is not something we have experience of. In general, the author's point is that we can get enjoyment from our toil. So our struggles in life, this is a possible source of enjoyment for us. And that enjoyment is the closest thing to something worthwhile that we might actually pursue. Rewards and punishments beyond enjoyment have literally no significance because they don't endure. their effects are canceled out by the deaths of the people that they're concerned with, and in turn, they're canceled out. These effects, right, rewards and punishments, are canceled out by our inability, our lack of an ability to direct the rewards of those labors to future generations. We are in a way powerless to decide, okay, well, what happens to these things I've accrued or amassed when I die. Wisdom features into this because wisdom becomes the capacity to discern this fact. Wisdom becomes the capacity to distinguish between what we can know and what we cannot know, what we do and cannot do. Wisdom plays a crucial function in clarifying our own limitations, specifically the limitations of our knowledge, and for that matter our own power, our power to affect meaningful change, lasting change in the external world. So to illustrate this idea that everything is futile, I'm going to read off this passage. This is I'm reading from Ecclesiastes 1:2 to 1:9. So beginning the quotation now. Utter futility, said Koheleth. Utter futility. All is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. Southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning blows the wind. On its rounds, the wind returns. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place from which they flow, the streams flow back again. All such things are wearisome. No man can ever state them. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear enough of hearing. Only that shall happen which has happened. Only that occur which has occurred. There is nothing new beneath the sun. End quote. So the underlying idea here is that one generation goes, another comes, right? The sun rises, the sun sets, and then he continues with other such images that water flows to one place and then they flow back again. The idea is that the earth remains the same, and that we're just experiencing cyclical drama, right? At the level of, if not the whole cosmos, and certainly of the natural world on earth. But there can't be, in light of this cycle, there's nothing new under the sun, right? There is just a cycle of nature that humans can't change. We can claim to have developed something new, but we are lying, right? Or mistaken. So from Ecclesiastes 1:10 to 1:11, sometimes there is a phenomenon of which they say, look, this one is new. It occurred long since in ages that went by before us. The earlier ones are not remembered, so too those that will occur later will no more be remembered than those that will occur at the very end. End quote. So what that passage is saying is that, look, there are people who claim some degree of novelty, but they're actually wrong, and maybe it's just due to forgetfulness or something like that. One generation having forgotten something from an earlier generation. But in fact, there is nothing new. So this introduces a first major theme that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of there being cycles of the natural order. And it's in those cycles that all human drama plays out. And human drama, even though we think it's meaningful, is actually something that's just repeated since time immemorial and will go on indefinitely into the future. We're supposed to conclude from that, as the very first words that I read off in the longer passage a moment ago, that everything is futile. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? If there is nothing new beneath the sun, then the author thinks we should conclude from that that everything is futile. That word futile is important because it's translating a Hebrew word hevel that means something like air or mist The important thing is that when we're presented, say, with mist in front of us, that the mist looks like it's real, but when you go to grab it, it lacks substantiality. When the author talks about futility in this case, he means that like when you try to grab onto something, it's not real in a profound sense. Yes, that doesn't mean that the author is denying that the mist is occupying time and space, right? There is like some location the mist has. Yes, it really is there. It's not like an illusion. But what's an illusion or what's illusory about it is is the appearance that we might actually be able to grab onto something. In our own day-to-day lives, there are things we try to grab onto. These are the values we pursue. But they end up not being real in the profound sense that they don't actually add any meaning to our lives, and that we can't actually grab on to something in a permanent lasting way, right? That you amass all this wealth, you get all this job, these amazing professional accomplishments, or sports accomplishments, artistic accomplishments. But everyone is going to die one day, and that idea of death as an equalizer that cancels out the meaningfulness of all our projects, and then the author's skepticism about the life after death, these render everything like mist, like hevel. This is to say, futile. So the author then takes it upon himself to, as he puts it, probe with wisdom everything that happens under the sun. And it was in this probe, this investigation, that he discovered the futility of everything. So I'm going to read off to you this passage. This is from 112 to 114. Well, I'll read 115 as well. I, Koheleth, was king in Jerusalem over Israel. I set my mind to study and to probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun, an unhappy business, that which God gave men to be concerned with. I observed all the happenings beneath the sun. I found that all is futile and pursuit of wind, a twisted thing that cannot be made straight, a lack that cannot be made good. End quote. So the pairing of futile or hevel in the Hebrew with pursuit of wind captures this fundamental idea of hevel. Like it's ultimately a metaphorical use of the word, right? Because it means something like mist or misty or air. And then pursuit of wind, the pairing of that captures the idea that, well, look, this is all mist and you're just pursuing wind. You're pursuing something that lacks substantiality, and that this is fundamentally a lack that cannot be made good. The author is claiming that it was him. Again, the implication is that this is King Solomon, but we'll call him Koheleth, the author. Koheleth took it upon himself to probe with wisdom everything that happens under the sun. So this is part of his experience and the way that his wisdom makes him be a judge of what's valuable or not valuable. So I'll give an example of this. So this is from the beginning of chapter 2. So this is chapter 2, 1, verses 1 and 2. I said to myself, come, I will treat you to merriment, taste mirth. That too I found was futile. Of revelry, I said, it's mad. Of merriment, what good is that? End quote. So the important point here is that, like, what good is that is an important question to ask yourself if you're pursuing this agenda in the way Ecclesiastes is. He's presented with merriment, and then he asks, well, what good is that? I actually tried it. And I don't know what good it is. And that's supposed to be the end of that discussion in a way, right? Of merriment in particular. And the author does this with other things too, such as wealth. So as the author acquired more and more wealth, he found that it was again entirely futile and nothing but the pursuit of wind. There's just no value in the world. Everything is futile. Everything is hevel. Any pursuit we could find is just the pursuit of wind. So I'll read off this. This is from Ecclesiastes 2:11. Uh, yeah, 2:11. Then my thoughts turned to all the fortune my hands had built up, to the wealth I had acquired and won, and oh, it was all futile and pursuit of wind. There was no real value under the sun. Now, the author is using his wisdom to make these discernments, right? To discern what's hevel or futile from what's not futile, and it just so happens everything is hevel or futile. But even that wisdom, while it's superior in one sense, is not superior in another sense, right? The opposite of wisdom being folly, and the author thinks that even though wisdom is superior to folly in the sense that light is to darkness, the same fate awaits them both. The same fate awaits them both, namely death. And so the author details the way he came to loathe life. He's distressed, he thinks, by everything that goes on. He then despaired of everything he had ever earned, knowing that it would be passed on to someone else who might not even have his knowledge, his skill, his wisdom. And so he was consumed by heartaches and grief. But even these griefs and heartaches were futile. So there was no very point to the sleep that he was losing, and there was no sleep. There was no a point to the sleeplessness he was experiencing. Part of the author's observations is that there is a season set for everything in life and for every experience. There's a time for being born and a time for dying. And in the light of that cosmic cycle or cycle of nature, human affairs can't possibly have any value, because there are other forces that are actually at work in the world controlling things, right? And these forces determine when things that are built up fall down. And they determine when things are built up at all. Now, if you think, well, actually humans determine when we build things up, the author would reply back, no, that's actually not true, because you misunderstand. There was a season for building up, just like there will eventually be a season for falling down. Your contributions to the world are actually meaningless. You and all of your pursuits are nothing but hevel, and the pursuit of futile, that is, and they are nothing but the pursuit of wind. So I'll read off to you. This is from Ecclesiastes 3 to 9. 3 1 to 3 9. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns? End quote. The point, of course, is that that last question is rhetorical, and that there is no value that the man of affairs can get from what he earns. There is no value under the sun. Everything is futile, and the pursuit of it nothing like pursuing breath or mist or air or wind. So you might wonder what the worthwhile thing is. Is there nothing worthwhile? Well, earlier in this episode, I actually alluded to the quote unquote only worthwhile thing, and that is a direct quote. I'll read this passage off in a second, but the point is the only thing that we can do is enjoy this toil, and to do good things in our lifetimes. So I'll read this off to you. This is from Ecclesiastes 3:12. Just after the argument or sequence of thoughts that I read out about there being different seasons of everything. Thus I realized that the only worthwhile thing there is for them to enjoy themselves and do what is good in their lifetime. That's the only worthwhile thing. Is the enjoyment that we take in the pursuit of wind, right? The pursuit of our projects, the joy we get from toil and struggle. Life is struggle, and like it's 100% a futile struggle because we'll never actually make progress towards any lasting, enduring goal. Um, but there is enjoyment to be gotten in that struggle. Ultimately, we all have the same fate. All of our projects end the same, no matter how much enjoyment we took in them, if any at all, and no matter how much value we might have mistakenly thought they had. All of our projects end the same, which is death. So I'll read off to you Ecclesiastes 3:17 down to 3:21. I mused, God will doom both righteous and wicked, for there is a time for every experience and for every happening. So I decided, as regards men, to dissociate them from the divine beings and to face the fact that they are beasts. For in respect of the fate of man and the fate of beast, they have one and the same fate. As the one dies, so dies the other, and both have the same life breath. Man has no superiority over beast, since both amount to nothing. Since both go to the same place, both came from dust, and both return to dust. Who knows if a man's life breath does rise upward, and if a beast's breath does sink down to the earth? End quote. So what the author is saying here is that, everyone has the same outcome, even beasts. And so the author is going to dissociate, as the word here is in this translation, dissociate them. Uh, he's going to dissociate them from divine things. We're not going to be put in the same group as the divine, but instead we're going to put ourselves. It's funny, the author is not using the first person plural pronoun here, which gives us the impression he himself is not human, but he's talking about humans. But of course, part of what he's talking about is the human experience that even he has noticed by experience. That we're going to group humans not with the divine, but with beasts. And beasts have no afterlife, or don't obviously have an afterlife, depending on how we want to read this, the author's confidence level here and what he's saying. But the idea is that both go to the same place, both came from dust, and both return to dust. Is it possible that, as the passage says, that our life breath will rise upward, whereas a beast's breath does sink down into the earth? Well, it really depends on how we want to read the passage. The author ends with a rhetorical question, right? Is it possible? Who knows if a man's life breath does rise upward? Well, it is possible that that's a good faith statement of uncertainty, but it's also possible that the author thinks that what he said in the previous sentence about how both go to the same place, both came from dust and both return to dust. It's possible that that does represent the author's, considered judgment on the situation. Still, death might even be more fortunate for some people than others. So the author begins chapter 4 by saying, and I'll read this off. This is 4:1, 2, 3. I further observed all the oppression that goes on under the sun, the tears of the oppressed, with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors, with none to comfort them. And then I counted those who died long since, more fortunate than those who are still living, and happier either are those who have not come into being and have never witnessed the miseries that go on under the sun, end quote. In other words, there's a certain subset of the human population who, being oppressed, and as they're crying and, producing tears of the oppressed, still they're not even being comforted. And thus it'd be better for those people to be dead. And that it's in fact better in light of these miseries on earth, it's better for all those people who are not yet alive. And so the author is giving us quite a bleak picture of what it means to be a human being. That's not to say it's entirely bad. After all, I mentioned earlier that the only worthwhile thing is to take enjoyment in our struggles. But there is another source of possible benefit, which is companionship. The author especially warns against people who cut themselves off from others in the pursuit of amassing wealth, right? After all, it's just the more wealth you pursue, it's more and more like pursuing wind. And because of the way they're cutting themselves off from other people, they're not even enjoying themselves. But I'll read off to you why the author thinks companionship is important. The He says, and this is Ecclesiastes 4:9, two are better off than one in that they have greater benefit from their earnings. For should they fall, one can raise the other, but woe betide him who is alone and falls with no companion to raise him. Further, when two lie together, they are warm. But how can he who is alone get warm? Also, if one attacks, two can stand up to him. A threefold cord is not readily broken. End quote. So the author is presenting a couple different reasons to value companionship. One is the help we have in hard times, in hard troubles. If we fall into hard times, we have someone there who can help raise us up. And of course, when things are cold, we can lie together. And when we're under attack, we can help each other out. The part of, I mean, surely at some level, the literal meaning of the passage is what the author intends. But in addition, there's a broader point here, which is that like life is really bad. Having someone else to bear it with makes things be easier. It actually reduces the toil. And besides, it's pleasant and enjoyable to share our lives with someone else. One of the major enemies of this is the love of money. That when we cut ourselves off from other people, when we're just trying to pursue wealth and amass wealth. But the love of money is a particularly dangerous one, not just because it runs the risk of cutting ourselves off from other people and thus screwing us over in the long term or harming us in the long term, but it too is futile because and is merely the pursuit of wind because the love of money is never satisfied. The love of money is never satisfied. As the author points out in one of my favorite passages from Ecclesiastes 5:11, a worker's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat, but the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. End quote. And so the sleep is something in which we can take great enjoyment, even if when we wake up, we don't have a lot of to eat because we're not rich. But rich people, they don't even enjoy this very pleasant part of life, which is sleeping. Surely that's this, because they're so bothered by how much more they have to get. How much more they have to get because they're never satisfied and the love of money just grows and grows and grows. But more than that, there is this big idea that the pursuit of wealth actually cuts us off from enjoyment. That's the part of this about how sleep is really awesome, and it's a shame rich people don't get to sleep because they're too busy thinking about how to earn more money. That's supposed to be similar to the way that like there's this basic enjoyment we have from companionship, and the love of wealth cuts us off from that. Of course, we shouldn't lose sight of the author's actual major point, which is that this is all futile. It's actually all futile, right? As he puts it in 5:14. And I'll read off from 5:14 to 5:15. Another grave evil is this: he must depart just as he came. As he came out of his mother's womb, so must he depart at last. Naked as he came, he can take nothing of his wealth to carry with him. So what is the good of his toiling for the wind? end quote. Well, of course, the idea is that since we die without any of our things, what's the point of the amassing of things, of the accrual of things? We can take nothing of our wealth with us when we die. So the way we collect wealth is actually just the pursuit of wind, because at the end of the day, we're not making any progress towards lasting long-term goals. Um, lasting long-term goals. If you wonder, if you're thinking that the author then believes that the pursuit of wealth is something that should be avoided, I mean, the answer is that, like, to some extent, of course, that is the author's point. To some extent, it should be avoided, but he does think there is actually some good in, or something worthwhile here, and so he has says this at Ecclesiastes 5:17. Only this I have found is a real good, that one should eat and drink and get pleasure with all the gains he makes under the sun during his numbered days of life that God has given him, for that is his portion. End quote. So the idea is that there is actually a good thing about this, is that, like, there is actually some pleasure and enjoyment one might get from the accrual of one's wealth. Um, but of course, the author's sort of worried that if you pursue wealth, you're actually going to be end up, you're going to end up not even taking pleasure in anything. You're going to be too bothered by the pursuit of your wealth, right? You're going to stay up. You're not even and all night thinking about it, not even get some sleep. So the author wants our attitude towards wealth to be tempered by the reality which his wisdom is allowing him to discern. And again, he knows this from experience. That's not to say, however, that the author believes that he can fully lay down exactly what everyone should do. For example, when I read that sentence off a moment ago, I said, "Only this I have found is a real good." Well, those words "I have found" is the indicates an important qualification, is that he's relying on his own experience to make that judgment. But as he says in 6:10, I'll read off this passage. This is from 6:10 to 6:12. Whatever happens, it was designated long ago, and it was known that it would happen. As for man, he cannot contend with what is stronger than he. Often, much talk means much futility. How does it benefit a man? Who can possibly know what is best for a man to do in life? The few days of his fleeting life? For who can tell him what the future holds for him under the sun? End quote. So we see a bunch of themes we recognize there. What when at the start of it, when he says that, like, whatever happens, it was designated long ago, reflects that there's a season for everything, and that actually, in a way, everything has just been determined. We actually can't make progress and change things in a big, meaningful way. The human dramas just play it within a larger cosmic drama that we're unable to affect, even as much as we tell ourselves that we might be able to. But the idea of much talk meaning much futility, and then these rhetorical questions about, how does it benefit a man? Who can possibly know what is best for a man to do in life, reflects the way that the author's keenly aware not just of the limits of human abilities to make change, but also keenly aware of the human capacity to know things about what the best way to live is. So the author is saying, look, I've tried out all these things. What I've come to is the basic realization that the only worthwhile thing I've ever found is to take enjoyment in our struggles. But, like, I can't tell you what's the best way to possibly live. Um, That's not to say, however, that the author won't give some general advice. So, for example, at 7:2, he says, and I'm reading now, "It is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for that is the end of every man, and a living one should take it to heart." End quote. So the idea here is that, like, we should remind ourselves constantly of death, and that a living person should bear death in mind. Wise people are drawn. Wise people are drawn to such a house, he thinks. In other words, as a metaphor for death, wise people are drawn to things that remind them of death, whereas fools are drawn to a place of merrymaking. We, the wise, or people who aspire to some degree of wisdom, should should take that to heart and bear it in mind. The reason for this is that we can only have a proper view of what is worthwhile. And even this deeper, more mysterious question of what's the best way for a human being to live, even though the author is not going to give a decisive answer to that question, the beginnings of such an answer lie in the knowledge of our death as the ultimate destination of every one of our species and indeed everything on earth. Death is being presented as the great equalizer, since everyone has the same fate awaiting them, whether we're human or beast. Whether we're human or beast. It's only when we have death in mind and death in view as a great equalizer, as something that comes to the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the human and the beast alike. It's only when we have this in mind, and he compares us in chapter 9 to fish enmeshed in a fatal net and birds entrapped in a snare. Just as those things are true of those animals, so too are we sentenced to a so too are we sentenced to die. And it's only when we have that in mind that we can actually come up with a real compelling vision of what it means to be a human being and what our lives are like. And so I'll read off to you this passage from 9:7, from 9:7 to 9:10. Go, eat your bread in gladness, and drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes always be freshly washed, and your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with a woman you love all the fleeting days of life that have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days. For that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. Whatever it is in your power to do, do with all your might. For there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol where you are going. End quote. What I like about that passage is that it says very clearly that this is the only thing that the author thinks we can get out of life and of what we acquire in life. And the things we acquire in life clearly aren't something that could survive death, just like our wealth. And in fact, the author strongly suggests that there is no life after death in this passage, which was alluded to in an earlier passage, but not, said outright. It was just, he left open the possibility that our life breath might rise upward. But the idea is that there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol, where you are going. Sheol meaning something like, Sheol meaning here being used metaphorically as a place we go when we die. And so the passage might well have said, for there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in death where you are going. That doesn't mean there's an afterlife. It's just being used, as a stand-in for the place where dead people are, right? Or the state of death. We can't tell when this is going to happen to us. We can't tell when this is going to happen to us. And so just like the fish who are enmeshed in a fatal net or birds that are trapped in a snare, not only is the point that we too are caught and can't escape the net of our mortality, but moreover, we can't even see it coming. We can't even see it coming. Therefore, we should just enjoy the time we have. The book ends with a command to revere God and to observe God's commandments. This part of chapter 12, the second half of chapter 12, was almost certainly added later. So I'll read off to you just so that you can see what I mean. This is from chapter 12, verse 13. The sum of the matter, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. End quote. You might not know from just that one sentence that it was that this was a later addition to the text, but it's even very clear when you read it, because the first line of the addition is this from chapter 12, verse 9. A further word, because Koheleth was a sage, he continued to instruct the people. He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. End quote. Well, what that idea of a further word, and then we're going to switch to the third person. That's telling you that this is written later. And in fact, traditional Jewish authors believed that it was a later edition, and today modern Hebrew Bible scholars also think it was a later edition. But I don't think that's very surprising because until now the book was written in the first person, and then and the end the someone else switches to the third person by adding these words, a further word, and then so on. These are clearly editorial reflections and small additions. Now you could figure that out too, even if there weren't these this editorializing happening. There's nothing really said at all in this text that would lead you to think that the summary is, or that the text would be summarized by these words, revere God and observe his commandments. No doubt God was present through the text. The God was this being who set up the natural order in which human drama is taking place, right? So that attributes to God a very important role as the cause of the natural order in which human drama plays out. But but until now, the message had been that all of this human drama is actually futile, and that the positive message was restricted to merely this claim about how we should find enjoyment in our futile and struggles. Here's, for instance, a passage from chapter 11, verses 7 to 8. How sweet is the light! What a delight for the eyes to behold the sun. Even if a man lives many years, let him enjoy himself in all of them, remembering how many the days of darkness are going to be. The only future is nothingness. End quote. Like that's much more in keeping, right? The future is nothingness, the days of dark are many, but we should find enjoyment. That's not a message you could easily summarize by these words, revere God and observe his commandments. The Koheleth, whoever he really was, had a distinct message that he carries forth through the book, and this whoever is this later editor is simply making an addition. And again, he wants you to know that it's an addition because he's speaking in the third person, reflecting editorially on Koheleth's text, and saying a further word to introduce them. So, yeah, that's a very distinct message. What you might wonder, well, what are the actual last words of the book? That as Koheleth says them. Well, the last words are, and this is 12:18. All is futile. All is futile, which again, has a nice symmetry from to what was said at the beginning, because when we read this text, there's actually a very nice argumentative through line, a nice line connecting everything here. So what's the major point? Well, all is futile. That's the major point. So we should just enjoy the toils and struggles of our lives as they are. What happens when we die? Well, that depends. I mean, there are some passages that suggest the author just doesn't know and wants to suspend judgment. Other passages seem to suggest that the author thinks that, well, it's nothing. There's really nothing where you're going. And that's because death is just a state of non-existence. Overall, Koheleth has attempted to situate wisdom in the knowledge of the limitations of human knowledge. Once we know our limits and our limitations of what humans are capable of, not just what humans know, but what we're capable of, that's what it means to have wisdom. So because of this, or in this spirit, the author, whoever he really was, went out to test different things and to discern what projects were valuable and worth undertaking. There's a close relationship between wisdom and experience, and the author came through that experience to have the wisdom that the book contains. Probably the best summary of this book and of its message, the best summary is not revere God and observe his commandments, probably the best summary is all is futile and all of your pursuits are nothing but the pursuit of wind, the pursuit of mist. That doesn't mean that there's nothing worthwhile in them, though. The enjoyment is the only worthwhile thing. But when we're understanding worthwhileness, then we don't mean that that this is worthwhile because it is lasting or enduring. It isn't. Nothing is enduring, and we don't actually make a difference because there's a season for everything. There's a season for building up what we build up, and there's a season for tearing down what we've built up. But there's still enjoyment in the building up. And if we can look hard enough, there might be enjoyment in seeing things get torn down too. That's the actual point of Ecclesiastes. And I hope you enjoyed our look at this important philosophical text in the Hebrew Bible. I'm Doug Campbell, and this has been an episode of the History of Philosophy podcast. If you're interested, you can subscribe on YouTube or subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I also have a Substack, Plato's fishtrap.substack.com. And I also have a book available for purchase, An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which you can buy wherever you buy books, such as Amazon, or you can buy directly from the publisher, which is Hackett. Thank you very much.